Hello, today we're going to be talking about fastballs and improving your fastball grip to get better velocity, better command, better movement, and just make you an overall better pitcher. A lot of times fastball is the foundation to all of our pitches, being able to throw pitches off of them and make them look like a fastball. So to start with, we're going to start with what types of fastballs there are. Typically there's a 4-seam fastball, a 2-seam fastball, and a cutter. Fastballs are always thrown with these two fingers and our thumb. And that's done so because these are considered our power fingers. Change-ups are thrown further out onto our ring and pinky finger because these are not as strong fingers to apply pressure and force to really create a ball that moves as fast as we can throw it. The type of fastball that you throw will be dependent upon what you're trying to do and how you want to fit it in your arsenal. So typically a 4-seam fastball is a more straight pitch versus a 2-seam fastball that typically moves arm side, or traditionally called a sinker. Knowing what kind of movement profile you want will help you with this pitch development. The axis of your fastball will also help influence how it moves and like what kind of ride or sink you might get when you're throwing this pitch. So typically when we talk about axis, we talk about it like it's on a clock. So straight up and down will be 12 o'clock, and just off will be 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock will be perfectly sideways, and so on. And then for lefties, we might reference it as 11 o'clock back to the left side, and 10 and 9 o'clock if it was perfectly sideways again. So when we talk about an axis, we'll reference, it might say 12 o'clock axis, or we might say 3 o'clock axis, and referencing how the ball is spinning in space. A 4-seam fastball with a lot of ride or a lot of carry, or we call it Z-break in professional baseball. It's the ball that will shoot or will have a lot of life. If your catch partner is telling you, oh, it's really jumping today, it might be a lot of vertical break. And what it's doing is it's pushing against gravity, so it's just not sinking at the fastest rate. It's not climbing either, but it's creating that illusion that it's rising. Those breaks are typically closer to the 12 o'clock spin axis, and they're typically 4 seams. What's happening is the ball is spinning backwards and the seams are helping push against the air and move it back up. Versus if you are throwing a sinker, I throw a sinker, I throw my sinker around a 245 axis, so I'm almost perfectly horizontal, and that creates the seam orientation to help push the ball down and arm side to me. So keep in mind when you're playing catch or developing this fastball that you'd like to improve, or how the seams are spinning out of your hand and how they're starting in your hand. So things to keep in mind are the horseshoe, and how the narrowness of the seams get wider or how they're together in this. So what I mean by that is if your 4-seam might have the horseshoe to the inside or the outside, that might affect your movement profile. Similarly, if I throw a 2-seam like this, or somewhere in between where the ball, when it's released on the axis that we determine to set from how we want to develop that pitch, will move. So think about the theory first and then just play around with it and move it ever so slightly until you get a desired movement profile. Once you get the profile, then continue just to perfect that until you get the pitch and the design. So people might grip their fastballs super deep, or they might have them really out in their fingers. So the ball might spin better or worse, or well, when I say worse, less spin revolutions, RPMs, in the pitch, which will also help with movement profiles. The pitch depth is very much a feel thing. I typically grip all of my pitches much deeper in my hand than a lot of my teammates do, and this just helps me get a good feeling for where the baseball's at and where it's going to be at release. I found with me personally, if the ball's out further in my fingertips, it's a lot harder for me to control. That being said, I have a lot of teammates that are the exact opposite. So this is going to have to be a feel thing for you specifically to play around with when you're playing catch. One might feel drastically better than the other, so you'll just have to kind of figure it out from there. When we're talking about actual pressures, we're talking about how much you might have to squeeze the ball or relax the ball. Traditionally, changeups are talked about as being a very loose grip where it's just kind of sitting in there. Fastballs are typically a tighter grip, but should never be a death grip. You shouldn't be squeezing the baseball. So it should be where it shouldn't come out readily, but just have a nice firm grip. And you might find you might have to squeeze it less or have a little bit more relaxed grip to be able to get the movement profiles that you're wanting to get out of it. A lot of this is just how you play around with the ball, and a lot of it depends on your mechanics, your arm slot, how far you might have to throw the ball. Throwing it 45 feet is a lot different than throwing 60 feet. So understanding a lot of these things and how it might influence your game, but these are the very basic principles to keep in mind. So along the lines with the grip pressures, thinking about where that pressure is and where it's coming from on the ball. It might not be a perfectly like death grip on the baseball. It might be more pressure on the index finger, on the middle finger, or on the thumb. And play with all three of those and kind of figure out where that needs to be to get your best desired result. The movement profiles of each. So a four-seam fastball is going to typically have a much better vertical break and what's considered as life or zip. This is achieved through the axis and the rotation of the ball. So if there are a lot of RPMs on the ball, it's spinning really, really, really fast on a perfectly 12 o'clock axis, straight up and down. The seams will help that ball carry and kind of stay up. So the basic idea, if you understand that, now we know how to influence how that pitch might move if we start to alter some of those basic principles of that four-seam fastball. We see this with the cutter. So instead of a perfectly straight vertical fastball, the cutter is designed to go from arm side to glove side, and it's a cut. It's usually only a couple inches, but it's just a movement pitch off of the traditional four-seam. So if 12 o'clock creates perfect lift, then if I throw a ball at 3 o'clock, it's going to really help push that ball down. So if I want my ball to sink and dive, I'm going to kind of work more towards the 3 o'clock. Now understand all of these conversations are very generic and general. It's going to depend on your arm slot and how you're delivering the ball and your release point, how big the seams are on the baseball. There's a lot of factors. So keep that in mind. But generally, the closer to 3 o'clock, the more sink we're going to create. We assist the axis with the seam orientation. So the 2 seam, I'm creating this big open spot on the baseball where the wind can help push this ball down. And we're going to use this part of the baseball to accomplish that. So when I spin this baseball at 3 o'clock, almost like sideways, 245, it's going to spin like this, and we create this big bald spot on the top of the baseball. That bald spot, the wind is going to come over that and help push this baseball down. So as I spin it, and we're going to have the sink with the arm side movement. For more in-depth conversation, leave a comment below or send a DM to Trevor Holloway 15 on Instagram. Like and subscribe.